Good evening there, everybody. Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, of course, I thought that I would give my little fight analysis and my fight breakdowns of the fights that, of course, ended up happening on debatably the best card that, of course, we've ever seen. At least certain people would be calling it that. And I definitely think that if someone lived up to the hype, a certain amount of people, of course, they state that they don't believe that the fights that they were quite as good, as what they maybe thought that it was going to be. But to be quite honest with you, I thought that the majority of the fights that they were very good. If they weren't, very entertaining in terms of the closeness or the competitiveness, then I thought that they at least showed, very decent boxing ability. And of course, let me congratulate Mr. Dmitry Bivol for pulling off a fight that I personally had him losing in this fight, or at least I thought that he was going to lose. Now, of course, when you talk about the scorecard for this fight, I did eventually have Dmitry Bivol winning this fight, or, I had it anywhere from a draw to 7 rounds to 5 for Dmitry Bivol. Now, the scorecards, I believe they read about 8 rounds to 4, 1 for Bivol, 7 rounds to 5 for Bivol, and of course 6 rounds to 6 for Dmitry Bivol. But I think that Dmitry Bivol more deservingly won this fight than he did the last fight. Now, the last fight, I don't personally believe that Dmitry Bivol won. I thought that Artur Beterbiev, with his momentum and the fact that he hurt Dmitry Bivol and got him to retreat a little bit, I thought that won Artur Beterbiev the day in the first fight. But in this fight, for whatever particular reason, and unfortunately because of a lack of internet and certain other things, I wasn't really able to study the first fight, at least today, after rewatching or after watching the rematch, kind of the first time. But more than likely, if I had to predict why Artur Beterbiev slowed down in the latter part of the fight, because it did look like from round 3 onward, all the way to about the 5th or the 6th round, it looked like there was even a possibility that Artur Beterbiev was going to stop that of a Dmitry Bivol. It was clear that he was starting to hurt him and that he was getting Dmitry Bivol up in a defensive shell. But he really started to really slow down, and he was more active actually than Dmitry Bivol throughout the fight. Apparently, he actually had through more punches. But the question that I'm going to have to ask myself, at least taking a look at the rewatch, is that, first of all, did Dmitry Bivol, did he do a better job getting off the ropes? And I think that there's no doubt about it. I think that he created a vacated space, and he circled and made Artur Beterbiev get around in the corner when he tried to trap Dmitry Bivol in the corner. And that's what you basically want to do when a boxer is trying to trap you up against the ropes. And that's what certain boxers like that of a Caleb Plant did wrong against that of a Canelo Alvarez. They stayed up against the ropes way too long instead of creating the vacated space. And the best of the best boxers, at least that know how to use their feet and their foot movement, and also the best of the ranges, fighters like that of a Crawford and Inoue, and, even to a degree Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol, of course, they all know how to do that. Terence Bud Crawford, of course, Usyk, if I didn't mention those guys. Canelo to a certain degree, but of course he just doesn't have as quick as feet as those guys. But of course he makes up for it in other areas. But Dmitry Bivol did a great job with the footwork. But, the question will be, as I end up rewatching the first fight or comparing the punch stats, to that of the first fight, more than likely, if I had to predict, more than likely Dmitry Bivol was more active within this fight, within certain punches. And on top of that, if I also had to guess, more than likely, Beterbiev was probably also a little bit more active throughout this fight. And we had seen something within this fight that we had never personally seen before, which is that Artur Beterbiev actually slowed down in the fight, which is not really something that I thought was going to happen. I thought that was, I'm not going to say impossible, because of course it's not impossible for anyone to tire out if they blow their entire energy throughout the fight, but I definitely thought that if someone was going to get a little bit more tired, I thought that it was going to be the man Dmitry Bivol that was going to be using his feet and circling in the fight throughout the majority of the fight, and on top of that, mainly going to be the one regressing and mainly going to be the one retreating. But of course the question also is that was age possibly a factor, because Artur Beterbiev, I do believe now, is about 41 years old. Now, of course, there are certain people that are still at a very good peak or even prime point in their career, even when they do reach around that age, and I know that sounds insane to a lot of people, but there are certain fighters that are like that. Archie Moore back in the day, back in the Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis times, when he was either at the light heavyweight or the cruiserweight division, I believe he was one of those fighters where even in his late 30s and early 40s, he still was retaining his titles at that weight class for a very decently long time. Alexander Usyk, of course, right now, 38 years old. Of course, he's not maybe at his absolute peak, but one could debate that he is, because, of course, he just recently came off of great wins over AJ, Anthony Joshua, Danny Dubois, and, of course, that of Tyson the Gypsy King Fury, who, in my view, was a top 10 pound-per-pound guy. But Artur Beterbiev, I'm going to have to see if they do have a trilogy fight. And I'm not sure if they are going to have a trilogy fight because, of course, David Benavidez, apparently he plans to activate his status or really push for the unification fight between himself and now Mr. Dmitry Bivol, which would be a very interesting fight. But of course, a lot of us really would want to see a trilogy, and they may possibly give up a title or a mandatory position in order for this trilogy to happen. Because of course, if David Benavidez somehow does end up beating a Dmitry Bivol, say if that fight were to happen next, of course, that would end up ruining the trilogy fight. But congratulations to Mr. Dmitry Bivol for winning that fight. Of course, I'm going to talk about the other fights as well, but a great congratulations to that of a Mr. Dmitry Bivol for proving me wrong. Once again, I had predicted that Beterbiev was going to win this fight, and I thought that he was going to do it more dominantly than what he did in the first fight. But once again, I'm going to have to rewatch the first fight and also kind of rewatch this rematch and kind of see maybe why or what the main factor was or the function of why Artur Beterbiev ended up tiring out so much within this fight. And maybe it was just because Dmitry Bivol's movement, and of course, he was throwing a little bit more. But to be honest with you, Dmitry Bivol's game plan, other than moving, a little bit better around the ropes, it really didn't look like he had much of a better plan or much of a better skill set from that of the first fight. I thought that, to be quite honest with you, that even though Bivol, there were certain exchanges where he would land a very good 1 or 2 punches, per round, at certain times, so where he would land a good right over the top or maybe a good jab. I actually thought that it was Beterbiev in certain rounds that actually was landing, more punches, and on top of that, doing a little bit better in the mid-range, especially with the jab. I thought that the jab with Dmitry Bivol, what I will state is this, I think that he did body work a lot better in this fight than what he did in the first fight. That's what I'll also give him credit for, and I have to give Dmitry Bivol credit for that because Bivol has never really been someone that has a great amount of body work, and body work is something that is very, very personally important for a boxing fight, because not only if you chop down to the body, is that eventually going to chop down, up to the head. As they say, you chop a tree, the way to make it fall down is to chop at its end or to chop its body to make it chop down. But on top of that, it mixes up your attacks and makes you less predictable. And perhaps that was another one of the factors that Dmitry Bivol ended up doing against Artur Beterbiev. But once again, I have to give him a great amount of credit, whether I think that Artur Beterbiev ended up losing this a little bit because of age or not, because he still made certain adjustments that I did not think that he was going to be able to do. And that's what certain great fighters are able to do. They're able to make adjustments and able to win the rematch. And that's what Dmitry Bivol was able to do. Now, who would I necessarily favor in order to win the trilogy? I'm not really quite sure. Of course, taking a look at it, oftentimes, the one that is oftentimes favored in the trilogy, including myself, when you want to talk about who I would usually favor in the trilogy, usually I would favor the fighter that won the rematch. But, that's not always the case. You never know. Sometimes, every once in a while, the man that does end up winning the third fight, they're the one that won the first fight. Because maybe there was a certain X factor, in that second fight. But you never personally know. But it's going to be interesting. But I was not super impressed with Dmitry Bivol's mid-range game, but he certainly overall, did get Artur Beterbiev enough in certain exchanges, and he was able to back him up. I don't think that he was able to back him up quite as effectively as what he once originally was. I think that he was more effective at creating the vacated space and moving around Artur Beterbiev, but I think in order to win the third fight more valiantly or, possibly more dominantly, I think that he's going to have to try and back Artur Beterbiev up a little bit. A little bit more. Because in all honesty, I think that, for whatever reason, had it not been for Artur Beterbiev tiring out, now once again, I'm going to have to see why that is. But, it could have been completely because of Bivol. It could have been a little bit because of some other factors. I'm not sure. But had Artur Beterbiev, had he been continuing to go down the train like what he usually does, I have no doubt about it in my mind that he more than likely would have won this fight at least 7 rounds to 5 or 8 rounds to 4. But once again, all that is a little bit speculative because maybe Dmitry Bivol is the one, maybe he's the main reason why Artur Beterbiev ended up running out of stamina. But I've never personally seen that before with him as a fighter. But of course, he's never fought a fighter on the caliber and on the same challenge level as that of a Dmitry Bivol. So it could just be that these two are pretty much the natural counters for each other. But of course, I ended up getting my main fight prediction wrong. I'm not going to say that I'm shocked necessarily, but it was a little bit of a surprise because I thought that Dmitry Bivol was going to be a little bit more retreating. I thought that he was going to be a little bit less decisive in his punches. Now, I do still think that he's going to have to be better for the trilogy fight, especially within the mid-range game, and actually dare to back up Artur Beterbiev a little bit more because, Beterbiev, of course, with his power and his size, of course, we all know that that's a factor. But with those certain fighters, you have to actually show them something, especially punch them straight down the middle, to really show, to back them up. And I think that Dmitry Bivol, maybe his body work and that, maybe a couple of other things, maybe it was able to push Artur Beterbiev back to a certain degree. But Artur Beterbiev was just looking at Dmitry Bivol in the mid-range for way too long and pretty much just staying there. And Beterbiev is a better mid-range boxer and even a better long-range boxer than what most people give him credit for. But you have to know your limitations, especially against your opponent. And Dmitry Bivol is a guy that has faster feet than him. He's a guy that has way faster hands than him. He doesn't have more power than him, but he still can compete in the power category. And he's a guy that can also compete in the boxing IQ category. And in order to win this battle, Dmitry Bivol, he knew somewhat of what he had to do in order to win. Artur Beterbiev did not utilize some of the tactics and also some of his best attributes in order to win the fight. But congratulations to Mr. Dmitry Bivol. Very great fight. I would love to see a trilogy. Of course, if David Benavidez fights either one of these guys, it would be very particularly interesting. I highly doubt that David Benavidez would get in the ring with an Artur Beterbiev after a loss. And more than likely, of course, he would want the unified champion, but we'll see what happens. But on to the other fights, because, of course, on this fight card, I ended up predicting all 7 of the fights, and I believe that I went 3-3-1. Or if you want to include, the draw with Hamza Shiraz versus Carlos Adams, I really went 3-4 because in my personal view, I did think that Carlos Adams, I thought that he beats, Hamza Shiraz just by a little bit. I don't think that it was super wide. I don't think that it was 118-110 like one of the judges had it, which would have been like 10 rounds to 2. I thought that it was more 7 rounds to 5, maybe 8 rounds to 4. But I still thought that Carlos Adams did better in the fight. And that's going to be the first fight that I'm going to end up talking about, or perhaps not, because there, of course, were more important fights. But let me, of course, go down the list. First of all, the fight that I want to talk about that was on the undercard is Callum Smith versus that of John Buatsi, I believe is his name. Or maybe it was Joshua Buatsi, I'm not sure. The African fighter, who I actually thought was British, but the African fighter that had fought Callum Smith. And I'm very glad that Callum Smith ended up winning this fight. Now, I predicted that Buatsi was going to win this fight because I thought that he was going to be the fresher fighter. I thought that he was going to have more confidence. And I thought that Callum Smith, I thought that he was going to be another Artur Beterbiev victim. Usually when fighters face a fighter like that, or when they suffer a beating like that, they're never usually the same again. And oftentimes fighters that have gone through Artur Beterbiev, they never end up winning a championship level caliber fight ever again. But credit to Callum Smith, not only did he win this fight, to be fair, I was not able to watch the whole entire fight. I had a little bit of connection issues in the first 4 rounds, so I kind of caught the final 8 rounds of the fight. But Callum Smith definitely looked like he won this fight about 8 rounds to 4. It was a very good and competitive fight where both fighters kind of had hurt each other. But Callum Smith, once again, and I've been telling people for a very long time, especially when you have some of these channels like Dante's Boxing Nation and Boxing Eagle and some of these other guys that claim that Callum Smith was this quote-unquote European white boy bum, that was just from Britain. Well, listen, a lot of those guys, like for example, when you take a look at Joshua Padley, the guy who fought Shakur Stevenson today, that's a guy that would be a C or B grade level fighter. Callum Smith is not a C or B grade level fighter. He's an A grade level fighter. Now, he's not someone that, in my view, is an A plus level fighter. He's not maybe an A level fighter, but he's on that A minus level. When you talk about Callum Smith, once again, there's a reason why he was able to beat someone outbox and also knock out that of a George Groves. And George Groves is not the worst boxer in the world. And also why he ran through some of the other contenders in that weight class. Not a whole lot of people there that were overtly talented, but George Groves was somewhat talented. And of course, he was able to beat, Buatsi, who was a very decently talented African fighter. Not someone without his flaws. I said that this was a 50-50 level fight, but Callum Smith was really supposed to lose this fight, especially when you talk about how he lost to Artur Beterbiev, I believe just about a year ago. So once again, Callum Smith, and I was proven correct, at least in my personal view, about Callum Smith being at least on the A- level. I keep telling people that Callum Smith is not this bum that a lot of people try to say that he is. A lot of people say that Callum Smith is just this straight up and down European white boy guy and that they think that he's very similar to his brother, Liam Smith. Liam Smith is a guy that, in my view, is a B or C grade level champion when he was a champion. Callum Smith is not that guy. Callum Smith is a guy that was a natural light heavyweight guy fighting at the 168-pound weight class. He had bone-crunching power at 168 and also at 175. and he was able to win this fight that he really was supposed to lose on paper heading into this fight, but he was able to win it, and he was actually able to outskill and outbrawl that of Buatsi. So I'm very glad that Callum Smith ended up winning this fight, because a lot of people end up sleeping on those 3 wins that Canelo Alvarez has with Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, and Billy Joe Saunders, pretty much just because they're Caucasian fighters. But those fighters, were legitimate, at least A- level fighters. They were. A lot of people, once again, sleep on those wins, but those were not bad wins. Once again, if Demetrius Andrade or Jamal Charlo, if they had a win over any of those fighters, people would be stating, these same channels that claim that Canelo Alvarez fought bums, they would be claiming that Demetrius Andrade, if he got a win over any of those guys, or Jamal Charlo, they would be claiming that it's the biggest win of their career. That's what they would be stating. Now, with Demetrius Andrade, of course, that's not saying much, but, it is what it is. But anyways, moving on. Very great job by Callum Smith. It was a great fight. And, of course, that brings me on, to one of the next fights, which is that of Zhilei Zhang versus that of Ajit Kabayel, which, of course, is another fight that I ended up getting wrong. But I'm not really surprised or shocked about what ended up happening in the fight whatsoever. Now, I predicted Zhilei Zhang in order to win this fight because he was the bigger guy, and I thought that he would be a little bit more powerful, and I thought that he would have enough boxing ability. And, of course, Ajit Kabayel, even though he's a very decent boxer, he's also a guy that's a little bit stiff, just like a lot of other German or certain European fighters, but especially the German fighters. He's a little bit stiff. He's a guy that doesn't have a great amount of head movement, but he knows, somewhat of what he has to do. And I said that in order for Ajit Kabayel to win this fight, he was either going to have to do one of 2 things. He was either going to have to move on the back foot, kind of like a Joseph Parker did, and use quicker feet than that of a Zhilei Zhang and kind of get him to miss and get him to tire out. But he did something that actually was better. He actually pressured Zhilei Zhang, and he was able to go to the body. And he pretty much was able to expose all of the weaknesses that a Zhilei Zhang has. And I'm not really surprised at the outcome. I'm also not surprised that he ended up knocking him out within 6 rounds. What I was a little bit surprised about is that he actually had the courage in order to go straight at Zhilei Zhang. Now, of course, he had the courage to go at Frank Sanchez, and of course he had the courage, to go after that, I believe that one big Russian fighter. But Zhilei Zhang is a different breed. Zhilei Zhang is a guy that, of course, in my view, first of all, might be a little bit more dangerous than those fighters. He's more powerful than those fighters, certainly in my personal view, and he's heavier than those guys. But Ajit Kabayel, when I took a look at him in that fight, he actually was bigger and girthier and heavier than what I had predicted. I think that really helped him out in the fight. And once he got inside the range, of course, he suffered 1 knockdown in the fight. But other than that, Ajit Kabayel was in complete control of that fight. And I'm not really surprised because he pretty much went in there. Zhilei Zhang is a very decent boxer for what he can do. But the problem is that even though he has a size advantage, Zhilei Zhang is a guy that is a little bit too big for his own good. He's a guy that has a little bit too much fat on him, a little bit too much flab on him. And he's a guy that, even in the Joseph Parker fight, from what we've seen, he definitely does tire out as the fights go along. And unless you're someone like a Deontay Wilder that has very limited boxing ability, although, he can beat certain guys. Like, of course, he also beat Joe Joyce. And, a lot of people, of course, thought he could have got the decision over Filip Pergovic. But the thing is that Zhilei Zhang, his size, although it may seem like an advantage in certain fights, it's actually a disadvantage because just like what we've seen with Usyk and Tyson Fury, if you're able to move around that and if you're able to get inside the range or if you're able to make them overextend and miss to a certain degree, they're larger, so the more that they have to move around, the more stamina they're losing compared to the smaller fighter that is used to being quicker and having more stamina because they don't have as much weight on them. So the bigger guy is actually going to have less stamina as the fight goes along. So very good job with that of Ajit Kabayel. I'm going to be very interested to see where he ends up going next because, of course, this was a very excellent stoppage. I would love to see him against Jared Big Baby Anderson next, or maybe a Martin Bakole, and we'll talk about that fight next. Man-tittied Martin Bakole coming in 20 pounds overweight. But anyways, when it comes down to it, I'm going to be very interested to see Ajit Kabayel, I believe is his name, the German fighter. I would love to see him in several different fights. I'd love to see him against Joseph Parker. I'd love to see him maybe against a Dillian White if White is able to beat Joe Joyce. I'd love to see him against maybe AJ Anthony Joshua or some of those other guys. He would be, possibly even the favorite in any one of those fights that I just personally mentioned. It would be very interesting to see where he goes from there. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for that fight right there. Now let me go to Joseph Parker versus that of Martin Bakole. Joseph Parker versus that of Martin Bakole, very, very interesting matchup, but it was very obvious to me as soon as I seen, them face off in the ring that my prediction was going to be correct. That, Martin Bakole, that when I took a look at his record, it was obvious that even when he's in the best of shape, at least for himself, he's a guy that, if he does go down the latter part of the fights, he's another guy just like Zhang. He's not as big as Zhang, but he's a guy that has a little bit too much weight for his own good. He obviously uses it because he knows how to use it to his advantage to wear out his opponents and, of course, for his very great power. But what ends up happening if you fight a guy that, is able to compete with you overall in certain boxing ability, and on top of that is in better shape than you, is quicker than you, and is going to throw more than you. Now, Joseph Parker, in my view, is not the most technically sound heavyweight fighter or fighter that I've ever seen, but he's technically sound enough. And of course, he pretty much showed in this fight that the one major good punch that he has, or at least counter, is that good overhand right. He does have some good other counters, but Joseph Parker is not really someone that is a great multifaceted fighter. It just is what it is. That's why when he got in the fight against Dillian Whyte and AJ and, Joe Joyce, he ended up losing all those fights. It just is what it is. But Joseph Parker definitely has made certain improvements. I think that he's actually made improvements to his stamina. He's made improvements to some skill sets. He defends better. He moves his head off the center line a little bit better. I think that he's gotten a little bit all around better. It's not a complete world change, but, he's definitely gotten a little bit better. And when Martin Bakole, when I seen that, he was out of shape by about 20 pounds. And by the way, Martin Bakole, there's no way that you should have taken this fight. I understand that Martin Bakole, this guy, and I'm going to use this nickname for him because it was very obvious that hubris ended up getting to him. Of course, talking about cockiness or talking about overconfidence because, of course, he was talking about knocking out Dana Dubois and Alexander Usyk. And, of course, people, instead of calling him the world championship level fighter, they called him the world sparring championship level fighter because all he talked about was knocking out Usyk in practice and knocking out Dana Dubois, and all that is great. But at the end of the day, if you can't do that in the pros, then what does it really matter for? And of course, unfortunately for Martin Bakole, he was coming off of the biggest win of his career against that of a Jared Big Baby Anderson. But now that he ended up losing to that of a Joseph Parker, it's going to set him back all that much more, especially because he's a fighter that a lot of people are probably not going to want to fight. He's relatively technically sound, at least, at this point in time in his career. He's a guy that's very powerful. He's a guy that can last a little bit as the fight goes along. Now, he does tire out a little bit, but there's not going to be a whole lot of fighters that are going to be able to beat him, at least at his absolute best. Do I believe that he was at his absolute best here? No, I don't. But at the end of the day, you don't take a fight when you're this out of shape. So the reason why I really don't pay much attention to that is because just like Andy Ruiz in the Anthony Joshua rematch, everything ends up happening for a reason. And of course, people always talk about, well, this fighter wasn't really at their best. This fighter wasn't really at their best. Well, no, he wasn't really at the best in terms of shape, but this just really shows me overall one of the downfalls or one of the Achilles heels that Martin Bakole ends up having. And it's not really something always to be ashamed of. It's just overall something that we really have to fix. But it's obvious that if you take a look at Martin Bakole in a certain amount of his fights, he has an issue of being a little bit overweight, and it shows in some of his fights. And the longer his fighters can take him, often more times are going to go to a little bit more of a decision. Oftentimes the knockouts, if you paid attention to his record, they oftentimes have to happen very early. Now, of course, what surprised many people is that Joseph Parker was the one that ended up getting the knockout a little bit early in this fight, of course, within the second round. Some people, of course, didn't agree with the stoppage, but in my view, it wasn't really that big of a deal because I don't think Martin Bakole, I don't think that he was really going to make it anyway. But, it is what it is. But Martin Bakole, once again, hopefully this is a learning lesson from him. He can possibly come back, but being an African fighter, from the Congo or wherever he's from, I believe that they say he's from the Congo, a guy that is severely dangerous and very powerful, a guy that a lot of people are not going to want to face, is going to be very interesting to see how many more opportunities he ends up getting. I wish that the fight, of course, would have been a little bit better, but it was really Martin Bakole's fault that he ended up taking this fight. I understand that he felt pressure in order to really, impress out of Turkey Al-Rashid or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, Martin Bakole needed to know his limitations. Of course, we always have to have a great self-belief in ourselves, but we also must have a certain amount of self-reality or overall, that of self-awareness. We must know what our weaknesses and what our Achilles heels are, and we must do our best to try and fix them. And Martin Bakole needs to go back to the drawing board, lose about 20 to 30 pounds of that fat that he had in this fight, and overall end up going back to the drawing board. I would like to see him maybe against a Dillian Whyte next if Dillian Whyte ends up beating that of a Joe Joyce. It would be very particularly interesting if Dillian Whyte, of course, is willing to accept that fight, because Dillian Whyte, of course, still is somewhat within the higher ranks, and he may not want to take a fight like that of a Martin Bakole, and of course, who could blame him? So we'll see what ends up happening there. But anyways, ended up getting my fight prediction on that. It was a little bit unfortunate to see Martin Bakole, of course, so out of shape for this fight, a fight that really could have been a championship level fight, but it is what it is. But very good on Joseph Parker. You got to give him a great amount of credit for showing the great amount of adaptation and adjustment, and also great for him to come back in his career. Many people forget just a couple of years ago, people, including myself, were talking about Joseph Parker potentially being done in the sport in general. Because of course then once he got knocked out by that of Joe Joyce, and just before that, I believe that he had a split decision against Derek Chisora, and also a very tough fight against Tafa, that one Samoan fighter, I believe, that, is okay, but really no better than top 20 or top 30 in the world. It is what it is. Joseph Parker was actually able to adapt. He came back, got the win over Deontay Wilder, which didn't surprise me all that much because, Wilder is a guy that, is not a volume puncher. And Joseph Parker is a volume puncher. If you let him get off on you, in terms of throwing a certain amount of punches, then he is going to potentially beat you. And that's the same thing that Andrew Ruiz had. Andrew Ruiz, in my view, is actually a more technically sound boxer in most areas over Joseph Parker, but it doesn't matter because his feet are basically cemented into the ground, and he wasn't able to cut off the ring anywhere near effectively enough against Joseph Parker, because Parker, of course, was able to outthrow him with his quicker feet. So it is what it is. But good on Joseph Parker, because now this is the third big win in a row. He ended up beating Deontay Wilder dominantly. He ended up beating Zhang in a very tough fight, but he ended up beating him in my view. And of course, he just ended up knocking out Martin Bakole. That's 3 A-grade level wins that you can debate just ended up happening in a row. I would love to see Joseph Parker get the fight against Alexander Usyk next. But of course, there's talks about Usyk versus Danny Dubois in a rematch next. I personally would not be as interested in that fight as a Usyk versus Joseph Parker fight, because Parker is one of the more elite champions of the day. Now, he's only ever won a belt one time in his career, and he only kept it for 1 fight or 2 fights, I believe. But at the end of the day, he clearly is one of the better fighters of his day. And it now has to be talked about with Joseph Parker. I don't think that it can ever be debated that he's better than Tyson Fury or AJ Anthony Joshua for his day. But I do think that it has to be talked about if he's possibly better than Deontay Wilder for his day. Because Wilder overall, is a guy that, yes, he had his 10 title defenses, but Joseph Parker, with his last 3 fights, to be quite honest with you, he's had bigger wins in his career than the majority of the wins in Deontay Wilder's career. And once again, that's not me trying to diminish Deontay Wilder. I don't really know who would have won that fight prime v prime. But the thing is that both Joseph Parker and Wilder, they were both looked at a crossroads at that point in time. And Wilder didn't just get beat. He got his ass whooped in that fight. So it is what it is. But anyways, moving on from that fight, congratulations to Joseph Parker. I'm thinking about how many other fights there were on this card. Of course, I believe... But anyways, continuing onwards, the next fight that I'm probably going to talk about, of course, I could talk about Shakur Stevenson, and I'm going to save possibly the most interesting fight in my personal view for last, which is going to be the Virgil Ortiz versus Israel Madrimov fight. But first, of course, I'm going to talk about Shakur Stevenson, of course, versus out of a Joshua Padley, I believe was the British fighter that Shakur Stevenson ended up fighting. But, when it came down to it, of course, Shakur Stevenson put on a very dominant performance. I personally had him winning every single round in that fight. Oh, I also forgot to talk about the Shiraz versus Carlos Adams fight. I'll talk about that next, and then, of course, I'll talk about the Ortiz versus Madrimov fight last. But, of course, to talk about Shakur Stevenson, Shakur Stevenson, I think, is a very exceptionally talented boxer. In my personal view, he is one of the best skilled fighters in the world. However, once again, like I previously stated, to be debatably the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, which in my view, undoubtedly, Shakur Stevenson is not. It's no offense against him, but he does not have the resume, nor does he have the accomplishments in my personal view. Now, he is a legitimate 3-weight division champion, but like I've already stated, there are certain fighters that when you take a look at them at the beginning of their career, they belong more at that weight class, or they belong at a higher weight class. For example, when you take a look at Teofimo Lopez and Devin Haney, they really more belong at 140, really at a minimum when it comes down to it. If not possibly even more at 147. When you take a look at that, of, say, an Inoue. Inoue is a guy to where when you take a look at him at his lower weight classes, like, he actually belonged there. He was a guy that was smaller than guys like a Jamie McDonnell and other guys like that when he was fighting them. He was also a bit smaller than a Stevon Coolboy Fulton. Now, of course, he was definitely more athletically gifted than those guys, probably by a decent degree, but he definitely was smaller than those guys. But when you talk about someone like a Shakur Stevenson, it's not like he's someone that's a small 135 pounder. He's a guy that I believe is about 5'7" to 5'8", maybe even 5'9", and I believe that he has about maybe anywhere from like a 69, I believe, to a 71-inch reach. Now I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's only about 69 inches. But the thing is about Shakur Stevenson is that even though he is an exceptional athlete in terms of the speed category and he has excellent level boxing ability, I'm not quite sure if he's really going to beat certain guys like a Gervonta Tank Davis. And to be quite honest with you, it's going to be interesting to see if he can even beat guys like that of a Keyshawn Davis. Certain guys that not only have very decent boxing ability when they need to, maybe not quite as talented as Shakur Stevenson in that category, but they have the stopping power in order overall to possibly make the fight a differential. Shakur Stevenson just does not have A-grade level power. He's never going to have A-grade level power. It's just very obvious. It is what it is. He is not an elite level puncher. And once again, in this fight, it pretty much was proven again because Shakur Stevenson was laying punches on that of a Joshua Padley pretty much throughout the whole entire fight, other than that of the first round. Now, the fight, of course, was decently, overall, it was competitive in spots. I'm not going to say decently competitive, but Padley, of course, made it a bit more competitive than what, it probably should have been, especially for him being, so close. But at the end of the day, Joshua Padley is not an A-grade level fighter. He's also someone that came in on 2 days' notice. Now, of course, sometimes that can be an advantage, that can be a disadvantage. But the thing is that Shakur Stevenson was supposed to knock this guy out. If he is ever going to be the number one pound-for-pound fighter, in my view, he's supposed to knock that guy out within about 3 to 4 rounds at the maximum. It just is what it is, or at a minimum, I should say. It is, or, no, a maximum. But the thing is that I don't think that Shakur Stevenson is ever going to become the number one pound-for-pound fighter. Now, of course, there were certain fighters in the past that maybe didn't have extraordinary level power, like that of a Pernell Sweepy Whitaker or a Floyd Mayweather, that still, of course, became debatably the number one pound-for-pound fighter, but they still had enough power to really push their opponents back. Like, Pernell Sweepy Whitaker definitely had enough power to push Julio Cesar Chavez back in that fight. The question is going to be is Shakur Stevenson going to be able to push fighters like a Keyshawn Davis and a Gervonta Tank Davis back? I'm not really quite sure if he's going to be able to do that, especially with Gervonta Tank Davis. And if he ends up getting hit repeatedly to the body, then it might be a possible issue. Now, Shakur Stevenson may have the potentiality, overall in order to outbox Gervonta Tank Davis, because Davis has shown at times that he can be outboxed, especially because he gives up a certain amount of the early rounds. But I'm not really sure Gervonta Tank Davis would do that against Shakur, because Shakur Stevenson is a guy that Gervonta, I think, would take very seriously. To be quite honest with you, I think Gervonta Tank Davis carries a certain amount of his opponents, in my view, like Rolly Romero and some other guys. But then when we seen him in a real fight against that of a Ryan Garcia, we seen him start a little bit earlier. But of course, against Frank Martin, he was a bit slower. But I mean, so was Canelo Alvarez against Caleb Plant. To me, that's what that fight was kind of comparable to. An A-minus level fighter, but, someone overall that was a little bit bigger and very talented. So he kind of had to start off a little bit slower because he couldn't afford to give him early ground by overextending and kind of showing off the game plan. But I'm just not quite sure if I ever see Shakur Stevenson ever becoming the number one pound-for-pound fighter. Not because he doesn't have somewhat of the skill and the technique talent, but, the thing I'm going to say is this, and I may put this, overall acronym, in some of my videos. I'm going to use, the acronym of TAPE, kind of like fight tape. You have the technique of a fighter, you have the athleticism of a fighter, and you have the psychology of a fighter, and then, of course, you have the X factors of a fighter. That's pretty much the acronym that I would use. The technique, of course, is important because you have to be technically sound and smart. Of course, when you talk about the athleticism, of course, it helps to have power and speed. When you talk about the psychology of a fighter, all that is great, the technique and the athleticism, but it doesn't mean anything, overall if you don't fight smart or if you don't have the grit or the heart or overall really, the courage, to take risks in the ring, like an Adrian Broner, for example. And of course, X factors, like stamina or, did you come into this fight late? Is this at a higher weight class? Certain things like that. Shakur Stevenson has the technique. I think that he also has the psychology, but I think that sometimes he's a bit too technical for his own good. I think that he kind of fights sometimes, a little bit too technically sound, for his own good and, kind of like what a Lara does. It's not that he can't fight coming forward, but, I think that he also knows that he doesn't have the most amount of power. And I mean, all the power to him for knowing that, because I don't think that he's going to beat Gervonta Tank Davis on the inside. But that also brings me the question, are you really going to be able to defeat someone like a Gervonta Tank Davis? Because Gervonta Tank Davis is going to hit you. He is not a bad boxer himself. And I don't think that Gervonta Tank Davis, I don't think that he's going to pretend that he can just outbox Shakur Stevenson the whole entire fight. And in my view, even though Shakur, he may be slightly more talented than Gervonta in certain categories, Gervonta is also somewhat of an exceptional level boxer. And Gervonta has exceptional level power. Like, he's debatably the hardest puncher for any pound-for-pound fighter of his particular weight class. So once again, we'll see what happens with that. But once again, to move on to the next fight, we'll see what ends up happening. But I hope the best for Shakur Stevenson. I just don't ever see him cracking the #1 spot. But we'll see what happens. I could be wrong. We'll see. But in order for that to happen, he would have to beat Gervonta Tank Davis and someone else of that weight class, if not even another. Keyshawn Davis, someone else, possibly even defeat someone at 140. That's what he would have to do, in my personal view, in order to become the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. Now, the next fight, of course, that I'm going to talk about is going to be Hamza Shiraz, of course, the British-Pakistani fighter, I believe, that was favored to win this fight, versus out of Carlos Adams. And, of course, I predicted Hamza Shiraz to win this fight. I thought that the height and the reach was going to be too much of a factor. And Carlos Adams, let me give him a certain amount of credit, because he proved me wrong in this fight. I've seen in prior fights that sometimes he got a little bit too brawly, in some of his fights for his own good, and that sometimes he wouldn't always fight the most intelligently, but he definitely has become a better fighter as time went along. And in this fight, he had a great stabbing jab to the body, a jab that was almost non-existent by Hamza Shiraz, I believe. He had a jab, but, you can tell that Hamza Shiraz, he's not a guy that is a multifaceted fighter. He's a guy that pretty much is going to fight you either in the mid-range or on the back foot. He's going to throw that jab out there multiple times. He might stick it in your face, kind of throw a hook, to the body or upstairs. But he's not a guy that has a great amount of body work. He's not a guy that's great on the inside range. He's not a guy that is exceptional within the mid-range. He's a guy that pretty much is a weight class fighter. And there are fighters like this in every single generation. But I thought that the size, kind of like what I had seen many years ago with Jared Hurd versus that of Anarisani Lara, I thought that maybe there was going to be a similar thing here, because I thought that Adams wasn't going to be as technically sound as what I had seen him, basically in the past. Or what I mean by that is that I thought that Adams was going to be a little bit more, riskier in terms of his fighting style, or a little bit more, probably not as technically sound as what he was. And let me give him a lot of credit, because Carlos Adams in here, he pretty much did his best Canelo Alvarez impression. A lot of what he fought in here with the good head movements and the great timing, the great stabbing jab to the body, the great right hand over the top, the great mid-range game, he has matured into a great fighter, and someone that in my view is an A-grade level fighter. And I would personally love to see him versus a Janibek next. I would probably favor Janibek in that fight, but to be quite honest with you, if Carlos Adams was able to pull out of that fight, I wouldn't be shocked. I was very impressed with him. And of course, the fight was scored a draw, but I really don't count it as that, because I thought that Carlos Adams won this fight 7 rounds to 5. I don't think that I had it 118 to 110, which I think would have been 10 rounds to 2. I think that that's a little bit too wide, but, Hamza Shiraz, he definitely proved in my view that he's a very limited fighter, and I just don't see how he ends up winning this rematch unless he really adds something to his game. And this was the fight that I think that I probably researched the least. Unfortunately, I didn't have a whole lot of time, because I had kind of forgot about this fight, and I had some other things that were a little bit busier, but I still ended up somewhat getting it wrong. So, of course, I have to take, credit for that. Or, overall, I have to, kind of man up to that. It just is what it is. But Carlos Adams, one thing I'll state is this. The reason why I ended up getting my prediction wrong, it was because Carlos Adams was more technically sound than what I had expected. And I got to give him a lot of credit for proving me wrong in that sense. I got to give him a lot of credit there. And if this rematch does happen, I would also favor him again. Even if Hamza Shiraz was more active in the rematch, I don't think that there's really much he could do in order to beat someone like a Carlos Adams, because there's not really any particular range other than the long range, because of his height and reach, that he would be better than Carlos Adams at. He's not a better mid-range fighter than him. He doesn't have better head movement than him. He's really not someone that is an elite level defensive fighter. He keeps his hands up, but he's very straight up and down. He's a guy that does not move his head off the center line very well, just like a lot of other British fighters. He's a guy that pretty much is a weight class fighter, relies a lot on his athleticism. I thought that maybe he was going to hit Carlos Adams early and maybe knock him down. And of course he hit him with some decent shots, but he never hit him with a shot that really had Carlos Adams in major trouble. And he was very, 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 overall kind of, a little bit deterrent in their early part of the fight, which I think is the reason, why he kind of lost this fight. But the reason why, or he should have lost this fight, but the reason why I also think that he should have lost this fight is he's just not the fighter that a Carlos Adams is. He's just not. And in my view, Hamza Shiraz, they were talking about him versus Canelo. He's lucky that Canelo Alvarez was not in this ring because Canelo Alvarez would have bent him over. It just is what it is. Canelo Alvarez and Hamza Shiraz do not even belong in the same sentence. And to be quite honest with you, it's very interesting because once again, I thought that Adams, that he was doing his best Canelo Alvarez impression. I thought that it was a great performance by him, or at least as good as what it could be. Now, of course, one could maybe argue that if Adams was so great that maybe he could have made it more wide because, if Shiraz is such a limited fighter as what you say, then, why didn't he make it wider? Well, I have to give him a little bit of a break for that because Shiraz is a guy that's 6'3" for the middleweight division. He's huge. He's a guy that is the same height as Callum Smith. Like, he has the same height and reach as a Callum Smith, someone that's really a light heavyweight. Now, of course, Shiraz is not as heavy as a Callum Smith, but at the end of the day, once again, certain people always talk about the weight, but the height and reach do matter in fights. It just is what it is. And I think that there's a possibility that maybe there should be stipulations in the future for also height and reach for a certain weight class because there's no way, in my personal view, that you should be either at the junior middleweight division or the middleweight division and be 6'3". It just shouldn't be happening. It is what it is. But of course, certain people may disagree with me there. But Hamza Shiraz, he's a guy that he may pick up the belt. He may even possibly win against Carlos Adams in the rematch. Is he ever going to be a guy, in my personal view, that is going to crack the top 10 pound for pound? Is he ever going to be a guy that, in my view, is going to be one of the greater British fighters that I've ever seen? No. It just is what it is. He's a very limited fighter. He does not have an excellent mid-range game. He pretty much, in my view, showed me to be a rangy, tall weight class fighter that is relatively one-dimensional and had no idea overall to get off a certain amount of offense. He had very little jabs to the body. He did not move his head off the center line very well, and he really didn't have a multitude of ways of fighting. It just is what it is. But Carlos Adams, once again, I thought did a very good job. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for that fight. I thought Adams won the fight at least 7 rounds to 5. Let's go on to the final fight between that of Vergil Ortiz versus Israel Madrimov, the fight that I'm probably actually the most excited to talk about, because this was going to be a great redeemer of how good Israel Madrimov actually was. And of course, the Terence Bud Crawford fans, they've been stating for a very long time that Madrimov, that he's this Gennady Golovkin, or that, overall that old Canelo lost at his 4th weight class, and that, Crawford, he won in his 4th weight class, right? But we didn't know how good Israel Madrimov actually is. And today we got our answer. He's very good, but in my personal view, he's not anything above an A- level fighter, which is pretty much my assertion this whole entire time. He's a guy that, once again, like I said, Madrimov, and I pretty much got my prediction right on the money in this fight. He's not really better than Vergil Ortiz in any particular category other than quicker feet and quicker head movement. He did a whole lot of moving around in this fight, and, once again, his footwork and, some of his skills are very flashy. But Israel Madrimov is he's like one of those guys that thinks that he's super deep and that he's super introspective, but he really just talks a whole lot of nothing. Like, Israel Madrimov is this guy to where when you take a look at him on the surface, that foot movement and all that movement looks great and it looks super flashy, but he does really a whole lot of nothing throughout the whole entire fight. He barely throws. He's a guy that does not throw combinations. He's a guy that pretty much has to be first. He does not have a great multitude of ways of fighting. It just is what it is. And that's why in both A-grade level fights that he fought, he ended up losing. And in my personal view, I thought that Vergil Ortiz had a better performance over Madrimov than what a Terence Bud Crawford did. Now, I'm not going to hold that against Crawford too hard because that was the first time that we had ever really seen Crawford at that weight class. And on top of that, Crawford's like 37 years old. He's going to turn 38 this year. There's only so much that I can hold that against him. And on top of that, that was the first time that Madrimov was ever in a huge championship level fight, at least against a clear A-grade caliber fighter. We didn't really know exactly 100% what was going to pop out with Madrimov, but we did know more than likely what was going to happen in this fight. Now, of course, a certain amount of people, they had this fight very close. I think two of the judges, they had this fight 7 rounds to 5. One of the judges had it 9 rounds to 3. In my personal view, I really didn't have this fight particularly close. I was a little bit confused by the commentary, which, by the way, was awful during this fight. Awful, really, throughout the whole entire card, in my personal view. I thought that the commentary did a very poor job throughout a certain amount of the fights, but especially the fight that was the worst commentated was Madrimov versus Vergil Ortiz Jr. Awfully commentated. There was no way, in my personal view, that fight really should have been that close. Certain people had Madrimov up by a point. I don't know what weed you were smoking, but it is what it is. Like I said, Madrimov, he would land certain punches, but he would really move around and do a whole lot of nothing. Vergil Ortiz was the one that I believe was throwing more. He was having the more impactful body work. He was able to hurt Madrimov on a couple of occasions. Now, to be fair, I believe that there was maybe one or two occasions that Madrimov maybe had Vergil Ortiz a little bit stunned, but not to the same degree that Vergil Ortiz had Israel Madrimov stunned. It just is what it is. And I pretty much was right in my assertion that Vergil Ortiz was going to be able to get him with the jab and that he was going to outwork him. And that as long as he was first to the punch and was going to drown him, that he was going to win the fight. And that's pretty much what his corner said. He said that you got to drown this guy. You got to drown this dude because, that's how you're going to end up beating him. You can't let Israel Madrimov be first to the punch. He has too quick a feet and too quick a movement. But if you end up forcing him back, he's a guy that can't really fight extraordinarily well on the back foot. There are certain fighters that, once again, when you take a look at Madrimov, he can fight to a certain degree on the back foot, but not super great. It just is what it is. He's just not super great on the back foot. He's also limited in the mid-range. He's not the worst mid-range fighter that I've seen, but he's not great in the mid-range. He's really only great when he's coming forward and trying to set you up when you're coming forward, or when he's coming forward, or if you run directly into a shot. So I ended up getting that prediction correct, and I actually agreed with the judge that had it 9 rounds to 3. Now, I'll have to rewatch this fight, but I don't know what the judges or what the commentary was seeing. I really did not have this fight particularly close. I thought that Vergil Ortiz's pressure, that his amount of throwing, I thought that Israel Madrimov was doing a whole lot of moving and really a whole lot of nothing. And I've seen certain fights where the fighter ended up moving around the ring, maybe didn't throw as much, but they still made the fight close. Like a Guillermo Rigondeaux versus a John Riel Casimiro, or an Araceli Lara versus Canelo Alvarez, or a Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao. And they clearly won the fight, or, they at least made it very close to where it could have went either way. But this, in my view, was not one of those fights. Madrimov, once again, he moves around a lot, but he pretty much overall has to get off first. And if he does not get off first, he's going to have a lot of problems. It is what it is. So I predicted Vergil Ortiz by unanimous decision. That's exactly what happened. And I believe that he deserved to win, honestly, a wider decision. I thought that the commentary crew was terrible in that fight, in my personal view. But it is what it is. But anyways, I went 3-3-1, or really 3-4, if you want to talk about my fight predictions. I tried to do a little bit better. I wish that I could have done a little bit more research on the Hamza Shiraz fight, and also, of course, a little bit more on the Adams, the Adams versus Shiraz fight, of course. But, pretty much all the other fights I had a decent amount of research on. I'm not really surprised at any of the outcomes. I think the fight that probably surprised me the most was that of the Beterbiev versus Bivol fight, because I was not expecting Beterbiev to tire out like that. But we'll see what ends up happening. A very interesting card. I thought it was a great card. Definitely thought that it was worth the money, and I think that this card wasn't even that expensive. I think that it was about $30. Great card, great boxing event that I personally love to see. I thought that it was amazing, and I'm going to rewatch a certain amount of the fights, because the Callum Smith-Buatsi fight, the Madrimov versus Vergil Ortiz fight, the Beterbiev versus Bivol fight, the Kabayel versus Zhang fight. A lot of these fights were great. The Hamza Shiraz versus Adams could have been a little bit better, but at least it was competitive. It definitely was not a draw, in my personal view, but, it was relatively close, but it went to the wrong guy, in my view, or they clearly were trying to get Shiraz to win that fight because I think they believe that he has more marketability as a Pakistani-British fighter. Maybe someone like that of a Naseem Hamed or Amir Khan, but it is what it is. But anyways, we'll see what ends up happening a little bit later on. But that pretty much is about it for now. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.